When we think about the rights that we as women have lost in America in the last 2+ years, like how do we process that?
It's also very hard to say that we're grieving something whilst still in a state of trauma.
Welcome to Seriously Catherine, a self-confidence podcast for women who want to be taken seriously in the world of business. Here's your guest host, Dympna Weil.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dympna Weil, and for the month of August, I will be your host for the Seriously Catherine podcast. I'm an OBGYN, a women's health advocate, a writer, and a speaker. So during the month of August, we will be talking about a variety of topics, mainly to explore the intersection of women's healthcare, rights, community, and I'll be prescribing possibility. The epidemic of burnout in healthcare workers, in moms, in pretty much everyone since the pandemic has soared. That is something that we are going to explore. We're going to explore the ways it shows up. We're going to explore the ways that community can help us heal. And that's just one of the many things that we're going to look at. On the show today is Gina Moffa, who is a licensed psychotherapist, mental health educator, and media consultant in New York City. She's helped thousands of people who are struggling and seeking treatment for trauma and grief, as well as challenging life experiences in her nearly 20 years of practice. She has worked with Holocaust survivors, survivors of 9/11, as well as being a clinical director at Mount Sinai's hospital's outpatient program for those suffering and with addiction. She's received her master's degree in social work with a specialty in trauma at New York University. And she's the author of a recent book, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, a modern guide to navigating loss, which was a 2024 recipient of a Nautilus Book Award. My biggest takeaway from our conversation today was that grief spares no one, and grief comes in many, many forms. But it doesn't have to be something that you struggle with alone, and it doesn't have to be big and scary. It's okay to look to others and reach out for help. It was a great, great chat. But first, we have a hot take brought to you by Paint and Sip. So my hot take is history in the making right now. So our current president, Joe Biden, just announced yesterday, as we are recording this, that he will not be continuing his re-election campaign. So we have lots of questions swirling, such as who will be the nominee. Better be Mamala Kamala, in my opinion. And we should be referring to her as Madam Vice President. This is an interesting fact about her, which I don't think is very widely known, is that she became a prosecutor because her best friend was being abused when they were growing up. And she vowed at that time that she didn't want anybody else suffering that way, and that those that were responsible should be held account for that. And so since that time, she has been a fierce advocate for women. As I think about President Biden, what a very patriotic thing for him to do. One, he's taking good care of himself, knowing that, 4 more years of this kind of stress probably would not be the best for him. I'm conjecturing. I don't know that's what he was thinking, but I would imagine that had to play a role. But, I think it was a very patriotic thing to do. It moved me to tears because there's more at stake than just the presidency. He has a legacy and a trajectory. It's a trajectory and a legacy that he's leaving behind. Some say it's not enough time for Harris to run. I call BS on that. In Europe, they call an election and the candidates run and they hold the election like 6 weeks later. There's no 2-year campaigning over there with little getting done in those 2 years because, they're too busy just running ads and campaigning on the trail. So my hot take, why are we living campaign to campaign here? It does not have to be that way. There's more than enough time to run an efficient, effective campaign. That's my hot take. There are such mental health needs, particularly since the pandemic. It's also potentially heavy. So what was it about grief and trauma that resonated and drew you in as a specialty?
Well, I have been a licensed clinical social worker since 2004. When I started social work school at NYU, we were just on the heels of September 11th. I'll back up. Really, right after that was the first time that we were really understanding and hearing about PTSD and trauma in the mainstream. But the buzzword of trauma became a little bit more in everybody's living room. But one thing that we never really spoke about was the loss inherent to trauma and the before and the after. And so it felt really important to me that those two be connected. And so for really the majority of my career, whether it was working with September 11th family members, whether it was working internationally with asylum seekers, whether it was Holocaust survivors, whether it was working in different types of addictions, the common thread for me was always trauma and grief. Yet it felt to me that it was something that both graduate programs were not really exploring and recovery programs or outpatient mental health programs. It's just a really interesting thing that grief is something that not many clinicians really feel comfortable with, but actually that mirrors the fact that society is not comfortable with it. So I've been doing this for a really long time, really trying to teach and bring awareness to the fact that grief and trauma are sisters, but that loss itself is really interwoven within most mental health issues that and challenges that people are enduring.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you go back to September 11th, kind of being that defining event. I was in the city for that too, and I can attest to that feeling of just shared grief that was just permeating everyone. So that's an interesting event I think everybody can kind of relate to and understand. What I mentioned earlier is that you have you're an author of a beautiful book, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. In that book, you talk about a lot of different types of grief. I love because it gave me permission to think about loss and grief in a lot of different ways. You know, the different ways that we may experience it, like the loss of a friendship or the loss of an experience. So what do people come to you feeling or experiencing when perhaps it's the grief of a friendship or an identity? Like, what are their symptoms or how do they present to you?
I think, first it's important to understand kind of what it is. Most people present as really confused. They feel at times a lot of shame and a sense of helplessness around it because we don't really understand it. One of the things about the pandemic was that it brought out the understanding that we lose and experience grief in so many different ways outside of death-related losses. And I love that it became something that we could talk about because people now can bring that to therapy. Whereas before, I think so many people were suffering in silence. I think the idea that people can come and say, and actually I've gotten so many calls from emerging adults right now, right? There's the loneliness epidemic out there, but yet so many people are in this good vibes only, throwing away friendships, or walking away from things. And yes, we should always walk away from toxic things and people. However, we've hit a place where many people are incredibly unsure in relationships. And then they become I want to say that they begin to feel a sense of unworthiness or confusion about who they are. So especially the younger generation, they're calling me saying, I lost my entire friend group. One person got upset with me and I've lost the entire group. I have nothing left. I have to start all over. I don't know, who I am. And it's something that's really common. And I just feel like our sense of identity in so many ways is wrapped up in the people we keep around us and, or as we get older, the things we do with our life, our careers, etc. But in our younger life, the sense of belonging is really what is our identity in that place. So it's been very hard. And so, yeah, a lot of confusion, a lot of shame, a lot of helplessness, a sense of hiding sometimes, like it's a different thing to come in and lose friendship or have an issue with our identity, questioning our identity. And it is a bit of not a bit, it's actually very ambiguous. So these are losses that are ambiguous losses. And that is really where there's no closure and there's no resolution. And so we have to create our own, which is really hard to do.
And I think you hold such a tender space for people as you write about it. It's something that when you don't even realize that you have, that it is a loss, that it is a grievable loss. Reading that and feeling so held in that space, it really it does allow for such healing, and so it really does open up
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for writing it. It really does open up the definition, I think, of what grief is and what grief can look like. One thing I'm kind of curious about is to hear your perspective on our current world affairs, because something that I feel like I'm grieving and I'm hearing about a lot is this issue of this loss of rights, bodily autonomy. And as an OBGYN and a women's rights advocate, this is one of the most concerning developments in recent times. And so I wonder, in the context of grief, how might that look? When we think about the rights that we as women have lost in America in the last 2+ years, how do we process that? What can be done?
Well, first of all, I want to say, I don't want to see any more legal precedent set where the government is regulating women's bodies. And we have to do whatever we can to keep that from happening federally. But, it's also very hard to say that we're grieving something whilst still in a state of trauma. Because we're in a state in the world right now where it's not like the ball has dropped, the ball keeps dropping. And we don't really know what's next. And so it's been really hard to say that grief is the feeling outside of the sensation of shock and trauma, really scrambling to figure out how to stop the dam from breaking much, much more. And I think that two things happen with my clients, and I think we could see it on social media, is that people get fired up and they get angry and they sort of get into a performative place on social media just to get themselves, the ability to express their angst and the fear. And the other part of it is that people shut down. We're in the survival mode right now, I think, as women and hopefully parents of who will become women in this way, where we're really in this place where we are fight, flight, or freeze. And so I don't think that we've entered the mourning stages yet, because there's still so much to do and there's still so much action that's needed. And I think we're in probably one of the wildest rides in United States history, with every day being something more unprecedented or more outrageous things happening every day, that I think we're slowly either becoming desensitized and then we wake up and we're angry again. But I think so much of us at times feel helpless because we're the little people. You have such a beautiful job that you do every day, helping women and families. And yet I can imagine there's a sense of helplessness, and what if this gets worse? And so I think we're all in a state right now where we have to figure out how to get out of survival mode and do at least one thing that we can to take actions that will help us to remain a sane society.
I appreciate the distinction so much, to recognize that we are all still in that collective trauma phase. I think about a lot of colleagues that are in states right now where just doing their job, they are fearing potentially going to jail for the rest of their lives. And that is absolutely horrifying. It should really horrify and concern everyone listening, because nobody goes to become a doctor or a physician or a nurse or any other medical provider to do harm to anyone. We all do this to take care of people, to help them live their best lives.
My heart is with you and every medical professional right now in this place, because you really take an oath, and your oath is to humanity and well-being. And when you have to live in a country that potentially wants you to take an oath to God, in which this country has not been founded, it can be really confusing and terrifying. And so my heart is with you all. And that's why I think, we really do have to take, and this is something I would say for anyone grieving as well, right? We have to take care of our bodies. What is ahead for us will take endurance. And so we have to be in it for the long run, because this extreme way of thinking now with Christian nationalism and, this type of thinking is not going away. And I would say this whether we're going through a traumatic event or a loss of any significant kind, that we must remember that this is not a sprint and this is a marathon, and we must take care of ourselves to the point where we have the endurance to keep on fighting the good fight.
Right. So very well
But
stated.
thank you for your service.
Oh, and thank you for yours. I think it's really important to drive home to everyone listening that we each have a role in this too, while we are collectively feeling that trauma in whatever way we may be experiencing it. The world is shifting, to your point, ever so slightly in big seismic ways. The world was different today when we woke up than it was yesterday.
Every day.
I mean, as we record
But
this,
for sure today.
yes, as we're recording this, the president has stepped aside from his re-election campaign, has endorsed our current vice president, Kamala Harris, as the nominee. We do not know whether she will be or not. That has not yet occurred, but that really does change the narrative in terms of women's rights. We're in a very interesting place in the world.
And, even yesterday and last night, there was a lot of grief around the idea that our president was stepping down after, watching him, not for better or worse, get pretty bullied by the media for an extensive period of time. But there is a lot of grief. And I feel like they're watching kind of the news pundits tear up on TV, that there is a loss that we are still grieving, despite the fact that we have hope ahead, and that we, at the very least, don't have the oldest guy on the ticket.
Yeah. And to your point, I felt that as well with the teariness of a lot of the newscasters and the pundits, and that, to be perfectly honest, that gives me hope that there are hearts and emotions behind some of these people who can sometimes seem so without that. It's a very interesting time to be with us in this time. Yeah. I have to catch my breath on it. It was really, I felt that, how you just mentioned the grief. I was thinking about, how do you, as the president of the United States, make that decision to step aside? And then that mourning that has to be going on for what you thought was possible.
Well, I think, one of the things that viscerally affects me is the division in this country. And I really grieve, speaking of grief, I really grieve the idea that we were once all Americans fighting, the same enemy. And now our neighbors are our enemies and our family members are our enemies. And there's so much grief that has come with politics and the state of the world. And, then seeing the Democratic Party so divided and divisive, and the media really attacking, and politicians that we once revered and respected coming out to speak against the man who really in so many ways sacrificed much to become our president during a really chaotic time. I feel like the grief has sort of been coming for quite some time, and not that I'm, any kind of medium or charlatan here, but I imagine that his health has taken such a dive that I really find myself wondering, or at least I did yesterday when he stepped down, if she may take the White House sooner than later. But I think there's been a lot of grief that we just really haven't addressed as a nation, and it just continues to sort of get more and more and more diluted.
We don't have these hard conversations. In fact, we avoid them. Nobody wants to talk about the tough stuff or the hard stuff. We want to talk about all the pretty stuff that we can put on our Instagram posts or that we can TikTok and dance about. But who really wants to talk about grief and the ugly and the hard stuff? Nobody, right? They come to you and they sit on your couch and they talk about it. They come in and they don't tell the people at the front desk of, they never told my office staff they were coming to talk to me about the hard stuff, but that's what they did when the door closed. We get to hold space for really difficult things. That's what we need to be able to do for people, because life is not TikTok and it's not Instagram. Life has challenges, and we need to be able to talk about them.
We need to be able to talk about them and tolerate the difficult feelings and tolerate the differences. So absolutely.
Yeah. And our kids need to know not everything, you don't always have to feel happy and okay with things. It's okay to be angry and sad and to feel grief and to, not be okay all the time.
We set the precedent for our children. We are the role models. So
Mm-hmm.
if we are showing and sharing our emotions and we are expressing our feelings and expressing our emotional experience with our words and being healthy about it, we really model that for our children to be able to express themselves and express those hard feelings and know that there's a way to work through them and that they don't have to really destroy us. But I think we really set the models. We don't have to hide away our hard feelings and shove them inside or pretend they don't exist. In fact, that could be more damaging to our children.
Related, but so when you were writing this book, Gina, what was something that you learned about yourself going through this process of book writing?
Oh my goodness. A lot surprised me, not necessarily about myself, but I share my own story of losing my mother and being a grief therapist. Also thinking that because I was a trained grief and trauma therapist that I had sort of this ability to stand on the top of a boulder with my victory flag and
Mm-hmm.
say, "Oh, I do this. I've got this." And being really pummeled by grief and sharing that was pretty vulnerable, but also human, and also just reliving that in some way. It was a really different experience for me to share. I'm not a therapist who will like walk in and talk about my day, right, with my clients. I'm not somebody who's coming in and sharing. I want it to be about them. And so sharing this for me and feeling the openness and the willingness to say, I really didn't know about grief in the way that I thought I knew about grief until I experienced a very significant loss. And I have experienced a lot of loss in my family. I've had many sudden deaths, but there was something about my mother. It changed me, and it was the most life altering of losses. But the ability to be able to share that, relive it and share it, which I thought was going to feel impossible, really felt so cathartic and felt so healing. Yeah, I think it surprised me a little bit that I felt as open to sharing some of my deepest vulnerabilities in my own loss.
Yeah, well, I think that it is the fact that you did share your story that made it such a compelling read. And I think that that's what makes, for me at least, that's what made it really hit home and made it all believable. Like it was like listening to a dear friend who was sharing from a place of love and compassion. And then when you said, these are some of the different things, like the takeaways, these are some of the things that you can do, like the shares that you had. It wasn't like a therapist therapeutically giving you things. It was like a good friend who was saying, I've been there. I happen to be a therapist, so I have all these wonderful tools, but, and offering you like a beautiful, like warm hug with all of these tools. And so I think it was just a beautiful thing and so brave of you to share, but also so necessary in the way you tell your story for the readers to really connect. And I think that's really the essence of the book.
I appreciate you. You've got to have thick skin when you write a book, and that's something I also learned, because you and I and I know you're in this on this journey and yet, one of the things that is really interesting is being a clinician and doing that well and putting, getting your trainings and making sure you're up to date on everything and your entire world revolves around the people with whom you're working and being the best you can for them. And then there's this other thing that's like you have to be an author who does marketing and can look good and sound good, and there's all of these different things, and so you're playing so many different roles, and so it could be a really interesting, I want to call it, adventure. I really, really appreciate that. I just feel like when we write books and when we share as professionals, whether a medical professional or mental health professional, you really do kind of have a very fine line of, I've been around the block and I understand this journey, and I also do this work every day. And so you're asking people to trust you on two levels, which is as a human who's hurt and who's, and who's struggled and who's suffered, as well as somebody who works for me, 21 years with people who have struggled and who have suffered. And I mean, I have the fact that I could be speechless about it as I'm approaching my 1 year mark of having a book out into the world on grief. It's been an endeavor that keeps on surprising me all the time.
If you had one tool that you could share with our listeners, would you be so kind as to share something with everybody listening today?
One of the things that I talk a lot about in my book is the idea that we understand grief to be an emotional experience, but in fact, it is a full body experience. And so I want to normalize just very quickly the idea that you will go through brain fog and memory loss and clumsiness, and you will have a plethora of physical sensations and changes and experiences. And so when I say, if you're going through a loss of any kind, as I said earlier, to make sure that you're taking care of your body, we forget that there are not 5 stages of grief, and that it comes with a lot of anxiety and a lot of our nervous system being stuck in fight or flight or freeze a lot of the time. And so one of the tools that I am very consistent with is the idea that we take very good care of our body. And what that looks like is making sure that we drink enough water, we eat enough protein, we're resting and moving, we're getting time and sunshine, and we are out in nature connecting. We're also only connecting with people who respect and support us during this really, really important and unpredictable, turbulent time in our lives. And that also, it's okay to reach out for help, whether that's people you trust in your life, religious figures, doctors, support groups, or a professional therapist. Those are sort of, to me, the very basics of somebody going through a loss and who doesn't know what to do. I think we often get very, very confused with what we experience. And it can be so overwhelming to our system that we think we can do it all. And we think we can keep going, but we are incredibly changed. We're changed in our nervous system, and we are changed in our surroundings, and our friendship groups will change. And so all of this, again, takes endurance, and to be incredibly compassionate and patient with oneself. Although that sounds pretty basic, those are things that we often overlook as grievers, because we are thinking we must get back to our level of productivity, and we must, keep fulfilling our obligations. And sometimes, yes, grieving is a luxury if you're a parent or you have to go back to work, but you also must set aside time to refill your cup and figure out in what ways you can take very good care of your body whilst you are able to, because this will be with you for the long run.
No, I love that. And that is really just the essence of it, right? Because if you're not looking out for yourself, nobody else is, right? So this is the beautiful book that I love so very much.
There she is.
There she is. And for all my locals here in Saratoga, I'm so happy to say that this beautiful book is actually in our local bookstore in Northshire Books. So when you are up here, Gina, you'll find her right on Broadway. Isn't that amazing?
It's so funny because I was supposed to be up there and sign some. So thank you. I'm so grateful that one of my favorite bookstores is carrying her, and I've got to get up there immediately.
And they have your beautiful book, which I think really is serving so many and will continue to serve so many. And so I urge everybody to pick up a copy, because it will serve you in your friendships, in loss in your life, in ways that you didn't even imagine. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy life, seeing patients, and just changing the world in so very many ways. Any books, any other books coming?
Oh my goodness, I do. I am currently, in fact, thank you for asking, I am working on my proposal for a book on friendship loss and navigating challenging friendships. So it was great that we started out with that, because that is what I'm seeing so much of. And it is a passion of mine to help us all be better for one another and figure out what we need and how to surround ourselves with the people who can give that to us, and the reciprocity of that. So I'm hoping to get that out into the world within a year at the very least.
That is just, that's going to be amazing. Looking forward to it. I'll be on your pre-order list. Sign me
I
up.
appreciate you.
So,
I appreciate you.
so Gina Moffa, thank you very much for coming to the Prescribing Possibility podcast takeover here. Thank you, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Likewise. Thank you for having me, and all the best. This is wonderful. I can't wait to watch you soar.
Here is the Serious Business Lesson brought to you by the Palette community. Here's my serious business lesson. So not every thought that we have is true. So we have about 70 to 80,000 thoughts per day, and the majority of them are not actually true. So it's not that we're intentionally lying to ourselves, but our brains are sense-making machines, and they'll do their best to use the information around them to make the best educated guess that they can, like the supercomputers that they are. So that's why the game of telephone is so ridiculous sometimes and kind of hysterical. But no one's actually lying or giving you false info. Your brain is meaning finding and giving you an answer with conviction, and you just believe it. What if not everything we think is true? Well, when we find ourselves holding ourselves back or putting ourselves down or being mean or unkind to ourselves, that's a really good opportunity for us to take a look at the thought that put us there and then to question that thought. If the thought is not serving us well, we can get curious and question if it's true. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say you have a business and you just met with a brand new client. That client decided not to sign up with you. You start thinking, well, I should just quit now. I stink at this. I can't get new clients. That person just didn't like me. So we can pick out one of those thoughts and we'll just say, for argument's sake, they didn't like me. Is that true? I mean, it may feel true in the moment. You might believe that it's true, like they don't like me, but are you 100% sure that that's actually true? Maybe the timing was just off. Maybe the client got sick and put hiring on hold. So maybe it actually had nothing to do with you. So maybe we can think about it a little differently. Instead of they didn't like me, all of these other things, you can go to a more neutral place. Maybe this had nothing to do with me. You don't even have to go to, this just wasn't my day or something positive, but just neutral. But it maybe had nothing to do with you. And that's, I think, the most important thing to remember. Our brains are trained to go to the negative always. That is just how they are wired. It's important to recognize when those thoughts start going. It's like a negative thought train. And when you interrupt it, that is all you need to do, is just interrupt it. Then you have a moment to pause and say, well, that might not even be true. Now we have our Saratoga Lifestyle segment brought to you by Saratoga Living After Hours. So here's something you might not know. Earlier this month, famed actress from Mamma Mia, Amanda Seyfried, who lives in the Catskills, by the way, stopped into Northshire Books here on Broadway to support her friend and author, Liz Moore, who was there talking about her new book, The God of the Woods, which is set in the Adirondacks. So she didn't stay too long, but it was really cool to have her here in town, stopping by the Spa City. So to find out more about what's going on around town, you can check our show notes and find the link to the Saratoga Living After Hours Substack and subscribe there.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. And if you want to connect with me, slide into my DMs on Instagram. My handle is Catherine Hover.